I think, I mean, there's this like emotional response, of course, about the scale of devastation and horror that we are witnessing. Um, I think also maybe the inability to comprehend the scale of devastation, um, whether in Palestine or in Lebanon or in Iran or Yemen or elsewhere.
All right. Good day, everyone. We are here with another show. Today we have a very special guest, Tara Al-Alami. And of course, we are with Sister Vanessa Beely, who is slowly becoming a kind of a co-host, I always say. Which is very, very good. Tara, we have been chasing you for a while. So finally you are with us. First of all, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. And sorry about the chase.
No worries, no worries. Hey, Tara, I first wanted to start a bit with your background. You're a Palestinian. You live in Canada right now. You could say also a colonized place.
Mhm.
You describe yourself as being from occupied Jerusalem and occupied Jaffa. You grew up in Jordan, now living in Montreal. Could you maybe walk us through how a Palestinian family ends up scattered across these four geographies, and what of each of these places mean to you as a Palestinian?
Yeah, it's kind of a classic case of a Palestinian exile. I think, anecdotally, I guess part of the generational trauma is trying to find alternatives. And so my parents and my entire family have always thought about securing a different passport, for example, so that going to university would be easier or getting work would be easier. And also to, I guess, preemptively um, try to mitigate any situation where exile may happen again. But essentially, yes, I'm from occupied Jerusalem and I'm from occupied Jaffa. My family was exiled and forced to flee in 1948. Most of my family actually is from occupied Jaffa, which now is essentially the settlement Tel Aviv, which was built on the rubble of our city. And my dad's family, the paternal side of my family is from Jerusalem. We used to live in and still have some relatives that live in the old city of Jerusalem. On the Mount of Olives is where my family is known to have lived for centuries, and also in houses that are built into the Damascus Gate, that are now falling apart because of the occupation's refusal for any renovation license. And so all of my grandparents were forced to flee. Some of them went to Beirut in the beginning, and tried to find a life there, but were not able to. And then went to Syria. Also, were not able to sort of settle there permanently, and so they ended up in Jordan, where the monarchy was offering the exchange of Palestinian nationality and citizenship for Jordanian nationality and citizenship, to Palestinians that were looking for a place to settle after having expected to return. Especially Palestinians with capital, which I think is important for the question about how I feel about being a Palestinian Jordanian, essentially by citizenship. And so that's how my family ended up in Jordan. My parents' generation was born in Jordan, at a very difficult time, right before the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and also right before Ma'arakat al-Karama, the Battle of Karama in 68, and the civil war in Jordan between the PLO and the Jordanian Armed Forces, and after that, the exile of the PLO from Jordan. to Lebanon. And so I kind of grew up in this heavily. I mean, I think everyone knows Jordan is effectively a police state. I've written about the process that sort of formed the political and social forces in Jordan to create the Palestinian or the Palestinian Jordanian national identity, to manufacture it after 1948, after 67, after 68, 71, after the Gulf War, when a lot of Palestinians were kicked out of Kuwait and came to Jordan. And a lot of that actually I learned from this book called Colonial Imagination by Joseph Masad, which I highly recommend people read if they want to learn about the Palestinian Jordanian and the Jordanian national identity. But essentially, I grew up in a state that is effectively a police state, and I still go back and forth because it is also where most of my family is based, and it is a sort of home in the grand scheme of things. Jordan functions as a buffer state between the occupation and occupied Palestine and the regional forces and the regional resistance. I think like the clearest example of this is Jordan's taking down of Iranian missiles that were not even their interception of Iranian missiles that were not even targeted at U.S. military bases in Jordan. They were just flying over Jordanian airspace and intercepting them in densely populated neighborhoods, effectively putting people in danger of being killed, of having their homes destroyed, in order to function as this buffer zone for the occupation. But just to briefly say, after high school, I wanted to study abroad, and so I came to McGill, and that's where I did my undergraduate degree, my graduate degree. That's how I ended up in Montreal, and why now I'm in a predicament of wanting to leave North America and move east. I really want to get closer to home, despite of or maybe because of all of these contradictions that I think it's our role um, to contend with as Palestinian as the Palestinian diaspora.
Yeah, no, very well said, Tara. And I always say, like, I'm from the Netherlands originally. My father is Algerian, also from a formerly colonized society in that case. And even though I'm a mix, I always say it's very unhealthy for people to stay in the West. To be very honest, people who have I would always say non-European background, not just an Arabic background, or it's for everybody who is not fully classified as white. It's a very unhealthy environment, and you see it more and more clearly right now. So I always say, if you can leave, if you have the means, definitely do it. I started working as professor here in China, which is for me very helpful because I can focus on imperialism and all these things, and I can teach about it without having to worry. But I did want to focus a bit on the Jordan part, where you said that there is this kind of idea of uh, how do you say that, connecting the Palestinian identity to Jordan. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because I have seen online often people saying, especially racists, that Palestine didn't exist, they're Jordanians and this and that. Well, can you maybe explain us a bit what's going on there?
Yes. So, well, I mean, I think the basic fact that we can all agree on is that these borders are arbitrary and manufactured by colonial and imperialist forces. But they do exist. And so the creation of different national identities in service of imperialist and colonial goals was beneficial for the Jordanian state, for other regional forces like the Gulf states and so on. And really, the development of the Jordanian national identity began after. at least from my assessment and to the extent of my reading and research, began after the beginning of the Nakba. So after 1948 into the 50s, when we saw the rise of socialist pan-Arabism from Jamal Abdel Nasser, the attempt to unify Arab states around a shared goal of anti-imperialism, versus the role of the U.S. or the rising U.S. empire, and at the time the declining British Empire, the French colonial forces in the region, trying to secure whatever power they had left using reactionary regimes that they had installed previously. Jordan was one of these targets, and so you start seeing the rise of Nasserist sentiment in Jordan in the 50s, even through the defection of certain of groups of people from Jordanian armed forces to form what was known as the Free Officers. And so these were people that were part of the Jordanian state infrastructure of the military that disagreed with the direction of the Jordanian state, forming closer relationships with the US empire, beginning to accept and receive financial aid and loans, also support to build military infrastructure from the empire, and wanting to join the Nasserist or Pan Arab project of building unity across the Arab world to defeat um, external invasion and intervention and encroachment on the region. And so, with that came a lot of repression. And of course, at the time, the most of the Palestinians that, I mean, first, as an important note, most of Jordan's population is Palestinian or of Palestinian descent. And so 70% of us, at least, in Jordan are Palestinian. At the time, in the 50s, in the 60s, the Palestinians that came to Jordan were mostly Palestinians that were coming from the more developed cities in Palestine. And so they were people that came with capital. They were people that came with maybe connections to the British Empire or the British Mandate, previously the British Mandate. And they brought with them a lot of resources, whether it's actual capital, whether it's access to certain, trade routes, certain connections to the outside world, the international um, market. And what is said really, sometimes facetiously, but I think it's materially true, is that Palestinians built Jordan. Palestinians built the Jordanian economy and Palestinians built Jordanian infrastructure. And so really there was, this thing happening that the state had to deal with, which is that the country was built by people who were exiled from a place that was only a few hours away by car, um, people that still felt and had this revolutionary desire to return to their occupied land, versus pressure from the empire to consolidate power internally and to repress any sort of desire to return to Palestine to unify the Arab world, any sort of anti imperialist tendency within the population. And that's when surveillance and policing and repression really began in a more organized and consolidated way. In the 60s, when Palestinians were exiled en masse once again from the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinians that came to Jordan at that time are still living in refugee camps. These are Palestinians that come from backgrounds that are, from the peasantry or the working poor or the working class, did not really have much capital with them to bring, in most cases, towards developing the Jordanian economy, the market, and so on. And so, right now in 2026, we're on the fourth generation of those Palestinians still living in camps in Jordan, not having a national number, not having a passport in a lot of cases, not having access to services that are not provided by UNRWA or other UN agencies. They face a situation that is similar in some ways to Palestinians living in Lebanese refugee camps, but of course with less militarization and less like direct threat of invasion and assault for many reasons, but one of them is because any sort of politicization or political organization in the 70s, in the early 70s, was systematically stripped from Palestinians living in Jordan. After Jordanians joined the Palestinians in 1968 in the Battle of Karama and defeated the Israeli incursion on Jordanian land, there was this sort of I guess, spirit of unity that existed, and by extension, more organization between these leftist or more progressive forces in the Jordanian population, within the Jordanian state, and the Palestinians. And so eventually that led to what is called Black September, which was effectively a civil war between the PLO and the Jordanian state. But the PLO and Jordanians that had joined the PLO in this fight, and the Jordanian state. I mean, I can speak from like my own family's history, which actually, because of this process of depoliticization and stripping of memory and stripping of any sort of politicized identity, I found out very recently my grandfather's neighborhood was besieged. I mean, I knew that these neighborhoods were besieged, but I didn't know the extent to which they were struggling. They had to ration bread, they had to ration food with their neighbors. They were fully under besiegement by the Jordanian state. We're talking about a very small city. Like, Amman is not that big. If right now I'm living in Montreal or in the United, or if whenever I go to the US, I'm like, wow, everything is so big here, because in comparison, the places where we live are so much smaller and more condensed and more densely populated. Anyway, they had to deal with this besiegement, and after the PLO was kicked out of Jordan and went to Lebanon, there was more concentrated effort on the stripping of political identity. And this happens through every avenue. Like, it happens through changing the school curriculum, it happens through creating this new identity, which is the Palestinian Jordanian identity. You're not a Palestinian in exile. You are a Palestinian who is now Jordanian and living in Jordan, and have sort of accepted this permanence of the Jordanian identity. And really, you only conceptualize return, and you conceptualize any sort of liberation of Palestine theoretically, but not really materially, because any sort of material organization brings with it a lot of risk, which we're seeing today, even organizing around BDS and organizing around boycotting McDonald's or Starbucks, these foreign mega corporations in Jordan, can and does lead to arrest and abuse by the state. And it's often youth that are taken and put into detention without charges, oftentimes released weeks later with signs of abuse. And so, just skipping a bit of time here, when the Gulf War happened and all of these Palestinians were kicked out of Kuwait and went to Jordan, there was this risk of repoliticization, because the Palestinians that lived in Kuwait were largely part of the PLO. These are PLO families that were oftentimes part of Fatah, and also other, maybe more Islamic factions within the PLO. And so there was this risk all these Palestinians are coming to Jordan with this political history, a politicization that the Jordanian state had worked really, really hard to suppress within the existing Palestinian population. And so, of course, in response, the suppression, the policing, the surveillance had to increase. And the way that you increase policing, suppression, and surveillance is through forming deeper and closer bonds with the US empire. And that directly led to the signing of the peace accords in 94, the Jordan's recognition of Israel as a state, and then, of course, the strengthening of relations to what we see today, which is Jordan's official position is a two-state solution. Jordan has custodianship of Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem's religious institutions, or religious religious institutions, whether they are churches or mosques, and they have this sort of responsibility that they've taken on to protect these buildings, to protect these forces, but effectively and materially, there's really not much that is done. Of course, Al-Aqsa is attacked on a constant. Al-Aqsa compound is attacked on a constant basis, especially during Ramadan, especially during Eid, especially during religious holidays. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was attacked during Easter, and Palestinian Christians were abused during Easter, during Christmas. And so right now what exists in Jordan is this, you know, I think, I don't know, I mean, I reflect about this all the time, but maybe for youth, like for people from my generation, this like state of you kind of like are existing in limbo. If you do start to undo and dismantle and deprogram the propaganda that you've been receiving, you find yourself in a state of having to reckon with contradictions that are honestly, I mean, of course, heartbreaking, but also really difficult when you are living in a state that is a police state that now uses Celebrite Israeli technology in for facial recognition, or for long, I think it's called like long distance hacking into phones and so on, and also exchanges resources with the occupation, like water and energy. And so when you are living in Jordan, the water you're consuming or the energy that you're using to light up your house or your place of work or whatever is directly stolen, in more often than not from your own people, because most of us are Palestinian. But then at the same time, you sort of are dealing with these decades of propaganda of Jordan is the safe and the secure place within the region. Jordan is the place where there are no wars. Jordan is the place where you are protected when there are regional wars. Jordan is stable. But I think like people around my generation that have come after this, or come from the last generation, which was heavily depoliticized, need to question the way in which we are existing, which is essentially either in service of empire or against it. And of course, the risk that comes with that is very big and very heavy. But really, like, the, especially during this time, during the acceleration of the genocide, seeing the amount of repression in Jordan has been, I mean, I don't want to say concerning, because concerning feels like such a, like I'm concerned, but the extent of attacks on any sort of expression, whether on social media or in on journalistic platforms like Al Mayadeen, or involvement within the Jordanian Communist Party, for example, or other leftist parties. The breadth of repression, I think, requires questioning on our end of what sort of security or safety or peace we are receiving in exchange for being in service of empire politically, economically, while people in Jordan are actually suffering. Like the conditions of living are getting worse and worse every time I go back and visit. Because of the long stretches of time that I'm not there, I'm able to see like the extent of decline of the standards of living. I'm able to see how much more expensive life has become. I'm able to see how much more people are struggling with not being able to put food on the table. There is a rise in people being unhoused, which is, for whatever reason, I don't remember really seeing when I was younger or when I was in high school. There's an increase in drug use, drugs that are smuggled through Saudi Arabia and Syrian borders now. And so all of these are contradictions that I think are really important to confront for Palestinian youth or Palestinian Jordanian youth, including the formation of this identity that at its basis exists precisely to exclude the Palestinian politicization from our daily life and to alienate Palestinians from their politicized potential, from their revolutionary potential, and to also alienate Jordanians from their revolutionary and politicized potential.
That, yeah,
Well said,
if
Vanessa.
yeah, I mean, I've got so many questions. We're going to have to get you back on. But what you're talking about in Jordan, I know in this region, for example, there has been a mass exodus of Christians, a forced exodus of Christians, particularly from Syria, but from all areas. And a welcome one, because it is the intention to force Christian Arabs out of the region. We can talk a bit more about that. But even in Gaza, even in the occupied territories, we're seeing that. I guess my question is, within the diaspora, the global diaspora, are you seeing an increase now in an attempt to eradicate politicization, to eradicate Palestinian identity, to eradicate justice for Palestinians since October the 7th? Or do you think this was a subliminal project anyway from the very beginning, when Palestinians were forced out of Palestine from 1948 and even before, of course, because we know in Palestine they were literally expelling journalists, expelling intellectuals, academics, professors. They were destroying records. Under the first Trump administration, Netanyahu was allowed to shut down the Nakba archives, for example. That's one tiny example. But in my opinion, there's so much war against the history and the culture of this region. In particular, Palestine. I mean, in Gaza, I can't remember how many archaeological digs there were that are now completely eradicated, right? In Lebanon, now they're bombing Tyre or Sur, where there are multiple UNESCO sites. And so I guess my question is, in the diaspora or living external to Palestine, how easy is it as third, fourth, fifth generation Palestinian, to maintain that connection to the revolution, to the resistance, to the history, and to the culture?
That's a good question. I think, I mean, in the grand, I mean, I find difficulty with saying it's not easy because I really think it's our responsibility to maintain that connection. And I think it was our parents' responsibility and their parents' responsibility and so on. And so whatever difficulty we face or may face, I feel like that's nothing in comparison, of course, to being in Palestine, living under occupation, resisting the occupation and so on. But I think the project of the stripping of Palestinian identity from its political potential has been, I mean, it's a long-term project and it has existed in different ways. And I think, just like Palestinian Jordanians exist as sort of their own or within their own manufactured identity, Palestinian Americans also exist within their own manufactured American identity that was sort of consolidated after the so-called war on terror and 9/11 and the anti-Muslim racism and repression in a targeted um, and systematic way that happened during the early 2000s, but also with what is not known as much really is the repression that happened against Palestinian communities that were living mostly on the West Coast in the 70s and the 80s, that came from these political families that were organizing within these PLO institutions in North America when they existed. So there's the case of the LA 8, for example, in Los Angeles. There's, of course, the assassination of Alex Saudi, and so on. Of course, the Holy Land 5 Foundation, which had gone through this really long and arduous legal process, that and some of the people that had some of the men that had been incarcerated have been released, but Shukri Abu Bakr still hasn't been released and is effectively on a life sentence. Um, Sorry, I think my phone is ringing. My bad. But is effectively on a life sentence right now in jail. Um, and so, besides this, or um, in tandem with this political repression exists a sort of, um, I guess, like designer cultural identity. It's like the watermelon and these Netflix shows that are maybe funny or whatever, but really exist within this desire, I guess, larger desire to fit into the mainstream or to penetrate the American cultural mainstream, and create space for the Palestinian identity within it, which I think if you come from a specific political school of thought or a specific political tendency, you can recognize as reactionary. I mean, my question is, why would we want to be part of the American cultural mainstream if we recognize the U.S. as an imperialist, as the imperialist enemy? And at the same time, I think if I try to analyze the conditions of what is now the Palestinian American population, the Palestinian American people, and the desire to organize within what already exists and struggle through it, I can understand the, I guess, desire to sort of be seen. But again, this idea of being seen but not in a way that materially changes conditions, in a way that doesn't materially advance the struggle towards revolution or towards return, to me is a uniquely American and Western desire that doesn't really exist within Palestinians that live. I mean, I'll just speak for, I mean, this is my own assessment, doesn't really exist for Palestinians that live in exile in the region around Palestine. I think the political priorities are a bit different, but what's what's good about or what I think, one of the good things that has come out of this recognition of this manufactured Palestinian American identity, in my own assessment, is the recognition of the role of the Palestinian American diaspora. And from that, we see this highly organized national struggle against the US empire from within it. And so the arms embargo campaigns, the attacks on logistics companies like Maersk, the attacks on, or, organized campaigns against the cultural sector, which serves and launders the imperialist propaganda, like the New York Times and so on. And so, while I think there has been this stripping of politicization from the Palestinian people who live in the West or have lived in the West now for many generations, I think what and I wouldn't even say that, this current genocide is what prompted it. I think maybe from 2021, from the uprisings in Jerusalem, from the unit what is called the Unity Intifada, there was this sort of acute realization that the role to play in the role that we play in the West, not only has to change, but has to be more effective and more, I guess just more serious towards creating a material and revolutionary change. And from that, after years of organizing, I mean, we can see how PYM the Palestinian Youth Movement has evolved over those years. You see protests, but you also see targeted, precise campaigns that attack the arteries of empire, and this is their language that I'm using.
Right, right. And you say so many things that I would like to jump on. Just like Vanessa just said, I definitely think we should have you on again in the future. Then you can also meet our other co-host Peter. But I do want to jump on something that you said. I think is something that I've been wrestling with for quite a while now, and I've also asked many of our guests. You were talking about Joseph Massad. We just recently had him on. You definitely check that show. It was great. But also this week we talked to Ramzi Baroud, and we talked about activism and the effectiveness of activism. And Ramzi seems to be quite optimistic about how the things are going, which is good. I like some optimism. But on the other hand, we also had a guest on, Leith Marouf, who is less optimistic about the activism and says it needs to evolve. For example, he is quite, and understandably so, he's quite, how can you say that, critical of the flotillas and that it's not evolving, not effective. How do you see that? We just saw that this huge drama with the flotilla activists, which again sheds light on, of course, the Israeli brutality. On the other hand, we've been seeing brutality over and over and over again, and there's just nothing happens. I mean, especially the West, they just won't do a goddamn thing. And then my question to you is, how do you see that? Do you see that as valuable? Do you also feel that this needs to evolve? Does it need to be more militant? What is your opinion on that, Tara?
I think, with any tactic or strategy with which you organize or, join the struggle, the anti imperialist struggle, there has to be a moment where, or I think ideally on a constant basis, you are reassessing and reevaluating the tactics and strategies that you're using. And I think with the flotilla, not being privy to organizational conversations or the process or the structure, as an outsider and also someone who knows people that have joined this flotilla, the last one, and have been detained and abused and released afterwards. I think one of the wins, one of the strategic wins that this flotilla has demonstrated is the extent to which the Israeli occupation enjoys impunity, and enjoys, and I really mean like the word enjoy, like revel in the ability to torture, abuse, assault sexually, psychologically, torture people in general. But and I think this distinction, sort of the extension of this Israeli, cartoonishly evil, honestly, like unconscionable desire to torture and to inflict pain and violence, the extension of that from the Palestinian political prisoner or the Palestinian in Gaza, the Palestinian in the West Bank in Jerusalem in 48, to legitimately a random person that had joined the flotilla and is kidnapped from international waters to be abused and detained in a jail cell by the occupation. I think that is an important strategic win. But I think also, like you said, it is something that we have seen time and time again. Of course, I think, the fact that hundreds of people this time were systematically kidnapped and abused and then released days later is important. And I would probably urge us to just not forget this moment, and to not engage in this sort of, I guess, I don't know, like American amnesia where you are surprised every time something awful happens, as if it didn't just happen literally yesterday. And so I think just committing this moment to our memory, and committing this strategy and tactic to our memory of what we have tried, what has worked, what hasn't worked in specific ways, is the most effective way to go forward as someone who is involved in the movement, someone who is organized, someone who is involved in an organization that does work here on Turtle Island. I think, in terms of just the methodology of organizing and the tactics that we use, the strategies that we come up with and want to reevaluate, committing this one to memory is probably the most important next step, because this is a long, long process. And within a few years, I think there will be probably desire to embark on another flotilla, and that might be appropriate at the time, and it might not be appropriate. And it's just important that we remember what has happened, what happened in 2000, in the 2009 Gaza Freedom Flotilla, what happened in subsequent flotillas, because this is a very, very long, or a strategy that has been used for a very, very long time. But in terms of organizing here on Turtle Island, I think really, like, the conclusion that I've come to is that the revolutionary position here, I'm someone who lives here because I came to university. I stayed for another degree, and then I worked a little bit. But there are people who live here because they have lives here. They live here because they are the second, third generation here, of Palestinians or Arabs and so on. I think really what's necessary is to adopt this position of revolutionary defeatism. I don't think there is a way outside of, or a way to win this struggle against the US empire, unless you truly adopt the position of, I want it to be defeated. And this is what, of course, Lenin was talking about during the First War, or the Great War, when he was talking about this desire for the Russian Empire to be defeated, adopting this revolutionary defeatist political position. And this is not to say that embarking on unstrategic, accelerationist, or maybe unorganized, strategies or tactics is what's needed right now. But it is to say that really the end goal should be the defeat of the US empire. The way that you get there, of course, has to be multi pronged and has to include a diversity of tactics. You need to organize the unions, you need to organize within labor, you need to organize within the cultural sector, you need to attack this empire from within, every possible avenue, while you exist within it, while you live within it, and benefit from the super profits that are generated from the exploitation, of your peoples, of people of the third world. And I think, like, um, I think I think to go back to Vanessa's question, this attempt to depoliticize the Palestinian people that are living in exile, specifically Palestinian people who are living in the West, in exile in the West, includes includes this belief about a future existing within this empire, the way that maybe the way that it exists today, or in a more comfortable way, or in a way that is maybe safer within the boundaries of this state as it exists. And what I want to say is that we should actually absolutely reject the notion that there is a future or a better future or a more comfortable future that exists for our people in this empire as long as it remains an empire. And I think the revolutionary position that we should adopt in this moment, recognizing that it's a very, very long struggle, is the defeat of this empire. And in service of Palestine, but also in service of people of the third world, because of course our lives here are sustained by the exploitation and expropriation of people and resources and labor from the third world, whether through invasions, militarization, encroachment, economic soft power and hard power, and the defeat of all arms of this imperialist state should be the priority. How we get there, I think, of course, there exist many organizational differences. As long as we align on the goal, I think, and build a broad coalition around that goal, um, that's when I would feel optimistic. I think about the struggle that exists here within the West.
You're muted, Vanessa.
I guess my question is, and I don't know how much time we've got left, is there a sense of urgency? Because when I look at the situation, obviously in Lebanon has an ongoing, another war right now with Israel encroaching on Lebanese territory. I don't for 1 minute think that Hezbollah is not going to win the ground war. In fact, I feel that I think definitely that the Zionist forces are falling into a well-laid trap right now on the ground with their advancement towards Nabatea in particular. But if we look at the Palestinian situation right now, Gaza now is, I think, 65% occupied by the Zionists. They're building barriers and I think 38 military bases to the east of the yellow line and the new orange line, which is a buffer zone on a buffer zone. And Palestinians are being pushed into a tiny, sliver of territory which has no ability, where they have no ability for sustaining themselves, because all of the abundant agricultural land is taken in the 65% that the Zionists are now occupying in Gaza. West Bank, of course, we know now there's the state appropriation of land, which is then going to be sold off. There are also the systematic settler ethnic cleansing ongoing. How much time do we have? How much of this, in your opinion, and from whatever direction, is reversible and able to be salvaged?
I don't know. I think I mean there's this like emotional response, of course, about the scale of devastation and horror that we are witnessing. I think also maybe the inability to comprehend the scale of devastation, whether in Palestine or in Lebanon or in Iran or Yemen or elsewhere. And then the more not I don't want to say rational, because I think the emotions that I'm feeling, at least I won't speak for everyone, are very rational. Like I think the most rational reaction to what we are witnessing is total, yeah, devastation. I can't think of another word. But you know um I guess optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect is is the way to go. I think I we don't I mean we don't have a choice. I think me as a Palestinian living in exile, but also I would also say for people that are part of or want to join the struggle living here in the West within the heart of empire, we don't really get the luxury of weighing these options, or we're not entitled to the luxury of weighing these options. Some people indulge in that luxury and I think allow themselves to sort of slowly concede and compromise and you know yeah, just concede and compromise in the name of strategy or in the name of urgency. But I think it's important to, of course, remain principled and disciplined in this moment, and important to remember that it's we are an important arm or an important leg of the larger internationalist movement against U.S. imperialism. Of course, we are not engaging in urban guerrilla warfare against the US empire, at least not now. Um, but but we play an important role. Um, and the strategies that we choose to utilize in the coming years, I think, will be decisive in terms of the direction of of the movement of the larger struggle. I think one of the most important um, tasks that we have at hand is exactly what the Palestinian youth movement has identified, which is the arms embargo, attacking every possible channel of arms shipment, arms manufacturing, the logistical, industry that transports and puts together these weapons, mobilizing workers to divest from weapons manufacturers. Also, this sort of ideological intervention in the West in a way that is able to be taken up by the masses, by popular consciousness, in a way that is accessible but also pushes the boundaries of where people are at. Um, I think in in addition to, or maybe because, like, I think we should allow and actually force the devastation and the anger and the rage and the sadness to mobilize us, um, because we owe it to our people, firstly, um, and secondly, even if you are not Palestinian and you feel like you don't owe it to the Palestinian people to mobilize and organize for them, your taxes that you pay every April are going towards weapons that are literally slaughtering people. And so there's no way out of that equation. Like, materially, this is where we are. And so um, it really is about feeling the entitlement to the luxury of defeat, or the luxury of sort of feeling discouraged on a collective level. And I think that's exactly what we need to fight. I mean, as an individual, I may feel helpless and hopeless and powerless and devastated, and unable to comprehend the scale of horror. But on a collective level, I can't allow myself or allow my comrades, or allow people who are part of the struggle to feel, um, on an organizational level, on a collective level, on a popular level, any sort of defeat. I mean, ever, but especially right now when the stakes are so high. And you asked if it's too late. I mean, Incidentally, I was having a similar conversation with my father yesterday. I think it was already too late when the Arab armies did not intervene sufficiently during the Nakba. I think it was already too late when the British, when the Arab bourgeoisie was forming alliances with the British mandate and the French mandate and so on. Um, and so, in terms of too late, we are extremely late. But I think there's no reversal, of course, material unless someone invents a time machine. In which case, like, sign me up. Like, I want to be part of that process. But in terms of like changing materially the past, it's too late. But what we have is the ability to build collective power and win a struggle by trying. You can't win if you don't struggle. Is something that I think we need to believe on a very deep level, as we continue to organize in the coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said, Tara. And you were just talking about how we are bombarded with imperialist propaganda. And I focus a lot on that as a social psychologist, and I also wanted to talk to you about that, but maybe we can leave it for another time because that will be a very long conversation. Um, the things the things that we are seeing around us when we watch television, when we listen to the news, etc. Even independent media is a continuous bombardment of negativity when it comes to the Arab identity, but also, of course, more focused the Palestinian identity, etc., etc. And I really wanted to talk to you about that, but I'll leave that for next time because we just have a few minutes. There's one question I still wanted to ask when it comes to current geopolitics in relation to the region in general, and that is, of course, Iran. And my question to you is, how do you see that as a Palestinian? I think I've seen writings of you talking about how Iran is portrayed in West Asia, often with of course propaganda from the United States, the Gulf states, about how bad and evil Iran is. But we are seeing something very differently right now, and my question is, how significant do you see the resistance of Iran right now against empire, and how significant do you think that is for the Palestinian struggle? Do you think this may be a turning point?
Yes, and briefly, yes. But really, I think what Iran has done over the past, it's decades of supporting regional resistance, whether in Palestine or Syria or Lebanon, and Yemen and so on, is of course essential in transforming the political landscape that exists. But specifically over the past few months, I think Iran has, essentially gone on a civilizing mission in the region. Um, what has happened is that any attempt to, as part of this propaganda apparatus, to excise Iran from any sort of regional or geopolitical resistance as something that is not only different, for example, from resistance that exists in Palestine. And here, like, I'm speaking about people that are, I guess, ideologically already in favor of armed resistance, ideologically already, they recognize the value of armed resistance, or at least the existence of armed resistance as such in Palestine, Lebanon, and so on. There's this systematic attempt, whether through sectarian propaganda or other forms of propaganda, to separate Iran from this ecosystem of resistance that exists in the region, not only as something that exists as like an entity, an abstract and dangerous entity whose goal or political interests are different from other regional resistance forces, but antagonistic to them. Iran is wanting to dominate the Arab world. Iran is wanting to, this likening of Iran to Israel, for example. portraying Iran as a colonial force that is wanting to put boots on the ground in the Arab world, which has never been a reality, or even, even if you read into the situation and sort of start going into conspiracy theories, I don't even know how you reach that conclusion. But really, like, these are irrational attempts to portray Iran not only as a different entity that is different and separate from regional resistance, but antagonistic to it. And I think really this, it's this form of inventing reality. Like Michael Parenti says, like, this is an invention of reality that simply does not exist. It's simply not true that Iran is antagonistic to regional interests when it comes to the resistance. It's simply not true materially, economically, politically, that Iran's interests don't align with revolutionary forces in the region. Now, when it comes to sectarian propaganda, I I don't like it. It's really difficult for me to even touch that subject because it just feels so irrational to me that I don't comprehend it on a basic level. Um, it's really strange to me that this sort of I think I can understand the process of how propaganda works and understand the process through which the state sort of injects these ideological beliefs or a certain ideology into its population. But in terms of me as a person who is Muslim, um, it's really difficult for me to understand the sectarian tendency within our region. It's difficult for me to really analyze it in a rational and material way because it it feels so irrational and just uh, I don't know. It feels really irrational to me. But I think I've observed a couple of things over the past few months. First is the undoing of the sectarian um, ideology that exists within the region against Iran. And so this acceptance of
Okay, so
Iran.
sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you, Tara. But for those in the audience who don't really understand what you mean by sectarian issues with Iran, can you be a bit more
Yes.
specific?
Yes, of course. Hi.
Hi there.
Well,
Hi
I
there.
hope the recording wasn't lost. I could hear
No,
you,
no, it
but
should be
I couldn't
fine.
hear
Should be
you.
fine. But
Okay,
I
great.
think Tara, you were saying that you see a change in opinion also in Canada on Iran.
Yeah, and this, I want to emphasize that this change was forced by Iran, rightfully so. Like when you attack a sovereign nation and when you attack a sovereign state, and they respond in a way that you completely miscalculated and you just did not expect them to attack in this way, partially because of this colonial hubris that exists, thinking that you are invincible, undefeatable. There's no way that Iran could possibly defeat the West, and so on. And also, when you're forced into a situation where you are forced to contend with the fact that your trade channels, that the movement of capital is no longer monopolized by you, when the price of gas is no longer, it's already not affordable to the average person, or people who are working class here in the West. When the price of gas increases exponentially, when the price of goods like food or other necessities increases exponentially over a few years, but also in a way that is acutely noticeable over the past few months, because your state, or in allegiance to the empire, is embarking on an unwinnable war. There has to be this change that happens on a psychological level, whether or not it's desired by the person themselves, or whether or not they're ideologically sort of aligned with the idea of regional resistance against imperialism, or imperialism itself, for at least. Um, and so I think it's clear that most people in the US and in Canada and in the West in general are against this war on Iran because they recognize that it's an unwinnable war. And they recognize that the effects that this war will have on the average everyday person in the West, who again is surviving barely even because of super profits that are accumulated through the imperialist process of encroachment and expropriation and exploitation. Um, Inevitably, you are going to create tension domestically, and you're going to create tension internally. I mean, I think maybe it's not as clear here in Canada because Canada's always a bit more behind the US in terms of even, the extent of repression, the extent of mobilization, and so on. Um, but it is, the sentiment is increasing here in Canada, but more so in the US. And in response to that sentiment, of course, you see increased domestic repression, increased policing, increased surveillance, increased tactics that were previously and still are exported to people of the third world, exported to violate the sovereignty of people of the third world, to violate the theft of resources, to assault their nations, to assault them, to expropriate their labor, to exploit their resources. That violence is returned and used at home because it has always been there. It's always been in the background, waiting for a chance to be used. And this is what we're seeing right now. We are seeing, the hyper militarization of streets in the U.S. We are seeing increased funding for police forces and law enforcement in Canada and the U.S. Even in Europe, we're seeing this increase in violence from the state towards people who are effectively fighting against the state's desire to sanitize this war or to create a situation where this war is, we made a mistake. I don't know if you saw, but the Prime Minister of Canada, the new Prime Minister Carney, I think in the beginning of the assault on Iran, I think he said something along the lines of, unfortunately, I think this violates international law, but we may have to consider joining the war. I mean, what sort of, it's this sort of like psychosis that exists within the colonial and imperialist imagination where you're like, oh, I think what I'm doing is wrong, but unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to join. And sort of this deprogramming and dismantling of that invincible colonizer, the invincible empire, I think is
Yeah, and
part of
white supremacy.
us.
It's part of white
Exactly.
empire. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think we are, witnessing this happening, and so um yes, like I do see this like sort of dissent maybe brewing here in the West, um, perhaps because of different political desires, political aims. I mean, the Democratic Party is trying to position itself as dissenting to the desires of empire, and so we also need to be really politically astute when we are determining who is our ally, who is our friend, who is our enemy. Um, but yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of all these people that are now suddenly all so happy about AOC. Who is there's a chance AOC can become the president of you, and I'm like, oh my god, guys, don't you ever learn? You know,
Yeah,
it's
I
so
think yes,
so
exactly.
incredible, so incredibly frustrating to see.
Yeah.
Tomorrow I'm gonna talk to brother Dimitri Laskaris, and he always calls Carney. He always calls him what is it, President Goldman Sachs. He always says President Goldman Sachs.
Yes, he is literally a banker. He is there to serve the banking elite, and I think President Goldman Sachs is an accurate descriptor.
Well, we are at the end now. You've been very generous with your time, Tara. And when you were just gone because of the disruption, I was just talking to Vanessa. Like this is really good. We really have to get you on
Yeah.
again if you are willing,
Yeah.
because there's such a wealth of knowledge here, and we learned so much, and we probably can still learn much more. So hopefully we can see you again, Tara.
Of course, I would love to join, and it was lovely to meet you, and hopefully we can have many more conversations.
Definitely.
Static crackles, voices rise. Truth breaks through their velvet lies. A screen of fire, a shield of steel. BettBeat media makes you feel. No borders, no change, no silence.